Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for Unlocking Employee Potential with the Power of Continuous Feedback, presented by Human Resources Today and sponsored by Bonusly. I'm Tori, the webinar coordinator of Human Resources Today, and I'm excited to bring you this fresh session on how ongoing actionable feedback empowers your team to take ownership of their performance, boosting engagement and development. I'm really looking forward to speaking with Erin Druska, Nikisha Dixon, and David Brown in what I'm sure will be a valuable discussion. Just so you know, this webinar is Sherman HRCI approved. All attendees that stay for at least 50 minutes, that's 50, will receive an email with the activity IDs within 48 hours. Please note that in order to receive the activity IDs, you must be present during the live webinar. Activity IDs cannot be provided to those who view the webinar recording. As mentioned, we will be recording this webinar in case you have to leave early. If you happen to miss any part of today's session, you can go to the landing page to view the recording. We're going to be sending that link across in the chat right now. Up next, we'd like to encourage you all to participate in the poll on your screen. As you submit your responses, I want to thank Bonusly for sponsoring this series, helping us to make this happen. Bonusly builds high-performing cultures by delivering an employee recognition and feedback solution that amplifies wins, connects teams, and shares insights. The results? Employees love where they work, are engaged, and deliver business results that drive your company forward. Managers play a crucial role in all this too. They are on the company front lines after all, supporting, coaching, and guiding their employees. With Bonusly, managers receive exclusive real-time feedback on how their teams are connecting and collaborating. They can leverage this data to cultivate a vibrant, effective team culture. Said another way, empowering managers with data empowers high performance. Bonusly believes that employees are the key to business success, and effective feedback, both positive and constructive, enables strong performance. This is essential to drive high-performing cultures. So thanks again, Bonusly. Up next, let's get some technical things out of the way. Please don't hesitate to ask questions during today's event. You can do so by submitting your questions into the Q&A panel found in the bottom bar of the webinar window. Great questions make for a great webinar, so don't forget to stick around for the Q&A session near the end of the hour to get even more fresh insight from our panelists. The chat is also available for open discussion, but please know we will be using the Q&A panel for your specific questions. My wonderful colleague Tara will be fielding your questions. She'll be happy to answer anything technical you might have, so feel free to pull up the Q&A panel, say hello, and let her know that you're listening. Closed captioning is also available for this webinar. To enable this feature, select the More button in the bottom bar of the webinar window and select the Show Captions option. Lastly, if you have any audio issues during today's presentation, you may choose to dial in by phone. All dial-in information can be found in your webinar confirmation email from Zoom. This information is also up on the screen, and Tara can relay it to you at any point if you need it. Up next, again, today I'm really excited to hear from our three amazing speakers. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to David to start off the introductions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Tori. And hello, everyone. We are so excited to be back with the Human Resources Today audience and just really excited about today's conversation. I really love that some of you are writing in the chat where you're from. If you haven't yet, drop that in there. We'd love to see where everyone is tuning in from. Like Tori mentioned, my name is David, and I am on the marketing team here at Bonusly. And I am calling in from Jacksonville, Florida, where it is officially summer. It's in the 90s and 100s. And so I will be inside or at the beach for the next few months. But I would love to pass this over to our speakers now. We have a little prompt on the screen, and so we'd love to hear from you all as well. But in the spirit of today's topic, we'd love to hear from you all what is one of the best pieces of feedback that you've ever received. And so we'll start with you, Erin, but just let everyone know a little bit about where you're calling from, what you do, and then the best piece of feedback you've ever received.
Great. Thanks, David. Hi, everyone. I am Erin Daruska. I'm calling in from Winston-Salem, North Carolina. I saw some North Carolina folks in the audience, so hello. And I am currently a senior people business partner for Christine Matthews Consulting, a One Digital company. Essentially, I act as a fractional head of people for biotech startups. So it's a lot of fun work to do. I'm also in our coaching practice, as well as help facilitate our management training programs. And best piece of feedback I've received, It was one that at first I didn't like it, which was that I was working for a manager and I said something like, well, I don't have time for that. And he's like, well, I can make time for you. And he's like, you just don't want to prioritize it right now. And I was like, ouch. So it wasn't delivered in the best way. But then I really reflected on it. And I actually now I don't say that anymore. I never say I don't have time for that. I just say, yeah, I haven't made that a priority yet, or I'm not making this a priority right now. So it shifted my perspective on how I look at time. And even though at first I didn't really appreciate it, I did actually really appreciate that feedback later on.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Aaron. And then we'll pass it to you, Nikisha.
So I'm Nikisha Dixon. I'm the Vice President of Human Resources at Bacara. We are a cybersecurity company. We're global, and I'm calling from Northern Virginia. So I saw a couple of Virginia attendees, and hello, not too far from you all. So the best piece of feedback that I've received is pretty early in my career. I originally worked in finance and then moved over to HR, but still had a lot of those financial, I want to say finance, but my mind did never move from that finance background. And I had a leader at the time that said, wow, I really enjoy talking to you. And this is over 20 years ago when the business partner model it wasn't even thought of. And it was some feedback that made me feel not only great, but it's been one of the important parts of my career of having that ability to think about HR, but also having that strong financial business mindset.
Great. Thank you both so much. And I will drop the LinkedIn for their companies. So if you all want to learn more, connect with them, I dropped their personal LinkedIn's a little up in the chat. And so I'm sure they would love to connect, talk more about what they do, and continue the conversation if you all have any questions that arise during this session. But like I said, we are just really excited about this topic, and I'm really happy that Aaron and Nikisha are both here. We did this webinar, similar topic, not too long ago, and it was just such an important topic. I think it's one of those that we're starting to hear a lot more this year. I think there's a lot of studies coming out, for employees who really are craving feedback. And I know we'll dive into it here soon, but feedback is kind of like a distant skill that not many of us have ever been trained in, have ever really had much experience in outside of the workplace. And so it's kind of a scary thing. And so we're really excited to dive into it, talk about it from a few different angles. But if you have not been in one of our webinars before, we love to do ours Q&A style. And so if you all have any thoughts about the questions, anything resonates with you all throughout the webinar, we also like it to be engaging. And so we love when the chat is just going nonstop. And so we'd love for you all to give your thoughts on the topic, share some stories of your own, drop your LinkedIn's, connect with each other. But with that, we will dive in, and we'll start with you, Aaron, with this first one. Feedback, like we said, is a scary thing. And so how can we approach feedback with a more open mind and effectively communicate when we may disagree?
Yeah, thank you. And on the LinkedIn thing, if you request to LinkedIn with me, totally cool. Just tell me you were on the webinar so I know. I know you're a real person. Anyway, so yes, when it comes to like feedback, and I feel like first and foremost, we need to reframe feedback. I think it gets this sort of ugly word. People people are afraid of it, right? But it's really, the idea is that you're there to tell the person how they can improve or what they're doing well. It shouldn't be this big scary thing. And I think it becomes a scary thing in a couple ways. One, people have constructive feedback to give and they don't give it and they wait and then it blows up and then they are not in the best place to give the feedback. Or they assume the person knows they're doing a good job or not doing a good job and they just don't give the feedback at all. So really the foundation for me is that you should be giving feedback for two reasons. One, to improve behavior and reinforce that, or to redirect their behavior. And so with that, really coming from, Kim Scott's great, wrote the book Radical Candor, and talks about the idea of needing to care personally. So being a good human and caring about the people that you're giving the feedback, and coming from that place of caring in order to help them get better. Like someone was, in the chat had mentioned about a time when they were like not correcting someone's mistakes for them and letting them correct them themselves so they can learn, but letting them know, like, hey, I can help you with this, but this is how we best learn. Like, we make a mistake and it's like, oh, I remember that. I'm not gonna do that again. And so in the beginning, setting those clear expectations and saying to someone, hey, and it's okay to make a mistake, and if you do, let's talk about how do we correct that. And what do we learn from that mistake versus it being something, punishable. Really a lot of it is about developing, as HR individuals, we are training our managers, and we need to help them learn how to get comfortable giving feedback, how to increase their emotional intelligence, so that their self-awareness and their self-regulation are there. I was talking to someone recently and they're like, well, I notice when I do this stuff. And I was like, oh, good. Because when you notice, you can actually then shift the behavior. It's different when you don't even know you're doing it. So it's just, the other big thing is always making sure you have your facts straight. I think that I know I made that mistake, speaking of making mistakes and learning from them, of not, of taking just what one side of the story and then trying to give that feedback to the person without asking them what was going on for them and getting the whole picture. So just really big on making sure that you have all your facts straight and you're asking the other individual. Like what I like to do now is if somebody, particularly if it's a client issue, I'd be like, hey, I heard from this client. Do you have any reason why they might be calling me? And the person might be like, oh yeah, this thing happened. I'm like, oh, okay. And like, we talk through it versus it being something punitive or me coming in already saying like, oh, you did this thing, when I don't really know their side of the story. So being open, allowing for silence when you ask questions so that people have time to process, making sure it's a good time for them to talk. So that's all part of that, being open-minded, because you need to give that space, create the space for that feedback to happen. I could keep going, but I'm not.
Yeah, I love what you said, Erin, about making sure that you have your facts straight. I know when I was a new manager, um, I I I don't think I had the development that I would have at this point in my career. I don't think I know I didn't, and I didn't have all the facts. And you get one real good shot to provide feedback. You got to have the facts. And I was reading something that Bonusly posted about performance enablement as a new performance management, and it really went through some important parts about giving out feedback and how to set up a safe space. And I think when you set up a safe space, it's making sure that you're not just giving negative feedback, that when your employee talks to you, it's not always about something that you didn't do or something that you could have did better, that it's really continuous about things that you've done really well and how to improve. So it's changing the mind frame about what feedback is and being 100% sure on what's going on. So having those facts.
Absolutely. And I think we'll get to it later in the conversation, but we at Bonusly definitely have a strong point of view around feedback, and especially framing, recognizing your employees and each other as a form of positive feedback, where, like you mentioned, Nikisha, it doesn't always have to be negative or constructive, but how, recognition and all is a form of feedback in a sense, and how it's equally as important. I will drop the link to this news article in the chat, but a really interesting article from Harvard Business Review, which talks about the 6 Ps for processing feedback better. And we won't go into all these right now, but I think they really are really helpful when talking about feedback, and especially in the sense of processing it. And so would encourage everyone, save that link for later, read the article, really helpful. But we'll start with you, Nikisha, with this next question. Like you both mentioned, managers are crucial. And it is, again, one of those topics this year that keeps coming up and up. And it's from a lot of different angles. Managers feel really burnt out. Managers feel like there's a lot on their plate. Managers don't feel like they have the training they need to do the job. And so all that really ties into feedback as well. And so, how can managers structure clear, actionable feedback tailored to different personalities, which are, very vast in the workplace?
Yeah, so I will take it back and like not even structuring the feedback, but knowing your employees, right? One thing that Bakara does well is that we allow our employees to own our goals, right? And what that means is that when we're doing our annual and individual goals planning, we ask our employees, we say, hey, what are some goals that you want to work on? Here's our company goals, but what goals do you want to work on? What goals not only do you think will help us as an organization, but within your span of control and that you're actually interested in working on? A lot of times you can find out a lot about your employee, not only about their career goals, but what motivates them for the goals they develop. When you let your employee lead and designing their career path with their goals, their development, you get to see a lot of different personality traits. So in past positions as with other employees, I've had employees that had very, very different viewpoints on work, even. I had one employee that just was very regimented to the 9 to 5, and I very these are the hours I work, here are the rules, here are the boundaries I want to follow within. And when you have an employee like that, you want to make sure that you're supporting them that's in the environment that's best for them. I had another employee that was extremely, they're both very, very, very proficient, very capable employees, but this employee was best working 6 to 9, taking a break between 10 and 12, would come back online in the evening. Wanted more flexibility. One, was very good at following deadlines, but wanted the creativity to get to the results. So knowing how to best manage each employee is the first step of knowing how to give the feedback. So I tell managers that when you're thinking about how to give feedback, find out first how your employees best work and what their motivation is.
I think that's such great advice because our default is to tend to want to do things the way we like to do things. And that doesn't always work for someone. It may work for some people, but it doesn't work for everybody. So yeah, getting to know like what is it, meeting them where they're at and being flexible and not saying it's my way and we're doing things my way and that's it. It's not gonna cause a really great working environment.
I remember when I first started here at Bonusly, I had a manager who had a sort of like a get to know me profile. And it was, some nice high level questions like favorite color, snack, that kind of thing. But then it really got serious for stuff like, how do you like to be given feedback? How do you like to be recognized, which is a huge thing at Bonusly. And it's one of those things that, again, we didn't necessarily have in our platform at first, but then added this feature to where you can give recognition privately, because really everyone, like you both mentioned, everyone's so different. People like to be told upfront feedback. People like even time of day. People are, I'm not awake in the morning. I'm not ready to process that yet. And so really just important to, like you both mentioned, get to know your employees. And I will drop this link in the chat. I think it might be what you were mentioning, Nikisha, earlier, but it's this whole conversation that we've talked a lot about performance management is, another hot topic that we can talk about in another webinar, but just different ways to enable performance, and feedback definitely being one of those. And so one things that we talk about are these 9 ingredients of effective feedback. And again, we won't go through all these right now, but definitely some that are really crucial here. Clear, 360, totally, unbiased is a huge one. Like you mentioned, Aaron, emotional intelligence. And so we'll drop that link. You all can read more about that. But we'll go to the next question, and we'll start with you, Aaron. Um, like you mentioned, actually, Nikisha, performance reviews. A lot of people save feedback for performance reviews. They don't have this what we call continuous feedback cycle.
Mhm.
They wait until their performance review to one, tell people how great they did, but also use that to go over anything that they could work on and do better. And there's so many faults that we can see with that. And like I said, we can do a whole webinar just about that. But in the terms of feedback, Aaron, how can a culture of continuous feedback improve employee engagement and development?
In so many ways. I am really been, I was having a conversation with a client yesterday about performance management. And I was like, I still have yet to get a client to just do just true continuous like feedback versus like still wanting to have like reviews. There's a place for them, but I'm like, I really just want to get to a point where like we don't need that because every one-on-one we're having conversations and we know where we stand. I truly do believe that people want to do a good job, that they don't come to work and say, how can I make things harder today for everybody? I don't think that's the case. Like I really think that people want to do a good job. People are assuming they're doing a good job, and if you're not telling them, they don't know. Which also goes to the other side. If you didn't tell them they weren't doing a good job, then how are they supposed to know? Especially if you didn't set the expectation to begin with. So we need to set the expectations up front so that people know, what is expected and how to meet that. But they also need to know, when they're doing well. It's good to know what their strengths are and being able to leverage those strengths. I'm a coach, and so I look at things from that sort of coaching lens. And when you're having your one-on-ones with your employees, it's so much easier to give that, like, just to have that built in. And somebody had put it in the chat earlier about liking to start with intent. And so if you let them know at the beginning of the employment relationship, hey, we're gonna have one-on-ones, and my intent in these is one, to just see what you're doing and how I can help you and clear any roadblocks for you, but I'm also going to give you feedback along the way of what's going well, what's not. But we can talk, and it's a dialogue. It's like, what should this person stop, start, continue? And if you're operating from a place of people wanting to do a good job, and that people are assuming that no news is good news, we really owe it to them to tell them how they're doing. I have talked to managers in the past that they don't want to give feedback because it's uncomfortable and they want to be nice. And okay, you're actually not being nice by withholding the feedback. You're allowing someone to continue to fail for your own comfort. And that's not really fair to that employee. And so we want to look at that sort of corrective feedback and how to do that, and how to do it when it's just a tiny piece of salt and not a whole pillar of salt. So we want to do this in a way that opens up the dialogue so that it's not a huge deal. If you're having these conversations all the time, then it's just part of the conversation. It's not this, oh, I'm having feedback today. And reviews, if you are still using a formal review process, it should be a review of feedback already given. It shouldn't be new information. There should never be surprises. And I know I'm talking to an HR audience, so you all know that. But our managers need to remember that there should be no surprises in a review. And it really, that's how I always describe it. A review is a review of feedback you've already been given. It's a way to document feedback you've already been given. So I think in this continuous, culture of continuous feedback, the one-on-one to me is like key, the key place to have those conversations and to provide feedback in a safe space on like weekly, bi-weekly, however often you're having it.
I think and I love what you said about giving feedback and, when it's a grain of salt instead of the whole container. I like that part a lot because it reminded me of about 10 years ago, I worked with someone in HR department, and the way that she used this analogy, she said, when a manager comes to me and wants to let someone go that has not received any feedback, I immediately say to them, imagine you come to work one day, you hang your coat up, you sit at your desk, get called to the HR's office to be notified this is going to be your last day, but you had no feedback. How would you feel? And she told me most managers, if not all, they're immediately appalled that she would say that and say, well, I would feel horrible. And then she would say, well, how do you think your employee would feel? And that always struck me because when we think about feedback, because remember, she didn't And she didn't designate what the feedback would be. We always think negative. And when we're building a culture that truly is feedback centric, we need to make sure that 3/4 of the time, which is pretty much the standard, it's going to be positive feedback. And then 1/4 of the time, where it's constructive feedback, it's constructive. It's that grain of salt. It's not the whole container. It's more of, hey, I saw this happen. Here's how we correct it. We're not waiting until it grows. And we should never assume that any employee knows how we feel. We should always be open and honest with our feedback, positive and negative.
It kind of reminds me of what you said earlier, Nikisha, how you let your employees and your teams really help contribute to setting their goals and the company objectives and all. And that really ties into, I think, the one-on-one. And I think one of the things that we do here at Bonusly is we do weekly one-on-ones. And I think every company does it different. Obviously, some people have a slew of direct reports, so it's really not feasible. But I have a one-on-one with my manager every week, and we have a template where we have things that we do async beforehand, answer a few different questions, put some agenda items on there. But then it really is up to me, the employee, to kind of say how I want the agenda to go, what I need to talk about, what I need help with, what I want covered. But then we always have that section where we can bring in feedback. And again, like you both mentioned, it's both positive and constructive. And I think one of the things we talk about in terms of recognition at Bonusly is it really has to be timely, specific, and personal. And I think that definitely ties into feedback as well, to where, like we keep talking about, it's really not beneficial to not be timely and say, hey, let me give you feedback on something you worked on 4 months ago, or hey, I forgot to tell you, good job. You did a really good job on that webinar 6 months ago. And it's kind of that aspect of, when you have this continuous feedback cycle, you're constantly just, recognizing your employees and your direct reports for what they're doing, but also giving them feedback that's timely. Because, like you mentioned, both of you, it's when you get to that performance review, you can actually look back at, okay, these are the things that my manager and I talked about. You've been doing really well on this. I've seen you improved on this, versus if you only talk about it once a year, it's okay, well, I could have used that information 6 months ago and been working on it this whole time. And so I definitely think this whole, theme and this topic of continuous feedback is just super beneficial, even talking from the direct report standpoint.
Yeah, and I was gonna say, even with like the mid, I have clients that just do annual reviews, but I tell them always have a mid-year checkpoint. It doesn't have to be formal, but at least say like, hey, if I'm going to review you today, here's where I see you at, and here's where I want you to grow. Here's where things need to improve. Because to your point, you don't want to get to the end of the year and be like, I could have fixed that 6 months ago if you told me.
Exactly. Um, but let's get into some roadblocks. And so we'll start with you, Nikisha, with this one. But it's not easy. Like we mentioned earlier, feedback is kind of this distant skill that a lot of us are still learning and developing. And so there's going to be roadblocks and hiccups along the road. But what are some common roadblocks to implementing this continuous feedback? And how can we overcome them?
Yeah, so I'll throw out one that I think a lot of us in this multitask world are dealing with. I know I'm personally dealing with it too, is time, right? It's one thing that I try to do with my team is to have a weekly one-on-one for 30 minutes. And I'll be honest with you, sometimes I have to grind my teeth if I have to change the day and time because other things come up, or I don't have 30 minutes, I have 15. But what I've learned is that everyone needs time, right? You need to find time to grow and develop your employees, to be present as HR professional for your organization. And it's hard. It's hard to block out the time to give that feedback, that positive and that constructive feedback. So one thing that I'll give you a tip that I use is that maybe I can't do the 30 minutes block in the middle of the day, but I can do, I have one employee that likes to work in the evening. So, hey, she's online. She enjoys doing the 5 o'clock. Let's touch base. It's a great time for me too, because it's quieter during the daytime. Or I have an early riser who likes to do an 8 o'clock touch base. So finding that time to not only be present for them with any questions they have, but also to give feedback. And one thing that I really strive to do, because again, sometimes we get into our groove where we don't give feedback. And as managers, we're just giving instructions or giving tasks, and we're not giving that feedback. So I try to make sure that in every conversation, every conversation is not going to have constructive feedback, but every conversation, there is one thing that I can compliment my staff on and my peers and anyone I come into contact with. Again, if I don't make it clear in the next couple of questions, I want to make sure that I say it now. But feedback, of course, is usual for you and the employee or you and your management team. But we need to be doing a lot more for peer feedback. We need to make sure that we are complimenting our peers and also helping them with challenges. We're not in it just for ourselves.
I love that idea of sharing the feedback with the peer because it's coming from a safer space, right? Like I'm not the person that that writes your reviews or that, I want to, this is my observation. I'm coming in, from a place of caring, especially if you have a work friendship, right? Where you can say to them, hey, can I, but also ask them, like, may I give you some feedback? Because maybe they don't want to hear it from you. So we want to make sure that we're asking for permission from individuals. And the best working relationships that I've had have been people that have said, and I had that call, I had something similar this week where someone gave me a call and said, hey, I want to give you some feedback on something. Is that fine? I was like, absolutely. And then they shared their feedback with me, which I appreciate. They didn't have to do that. But I don't want to continue doing the things that I was doing when I could have corrected it had I known. And it was just something, it was like a relationship issue where it's like, oh, I didn't realize the relationship dynamic. And so that person was sort of cluing me in to say, hey, you just might want to be careful here. So that was really appreciated. The other thing I will say that I think is a roadblock is fear that people get uncomfortable, right? They gave, we don't necessarily get trained to give feedback. So you did your best. We're only as good as maybe the examples we've been given. And maybe you are working with an employee who doesn't like being really like directly given feedback. And I'm a very direct person and I give that feedback and they, and then all of a sudden it went off the rails and it went horrible. And now I feel horrible and I'm never going to give feedback again because I gave feedback once. It didn't go well. I'm never going to do it again. And we need to give the tools to our managers on how to give feedback, how to have that sort of safe space to practice feedback. And it's one of the things that I get to do as an HR consultant is like, let's talk through how you're going to give that feedback. Let's practice giving that feedback. And, if you need me to script stuff out for you, I'm happy to do that and allow you to practice. But there's the saying that nothing ever grows inside our comfort zone. And so if you never get out of that comfort zone to give the feedback, you're never going to ever get better at it. And I spend a lot of time in this area and feel I'm fairly good at giving feedback, but I know I can always be better. So it's just something that I have to continuously work on too. So it's not like something like you're like, mic drop, I'm done. Like my feedback's, I'm the best giving feedback. That's it. I'm sure Kim Scott still practices giving feedback and she wrote a whole book about it.
That reminds me of a few things that we all had talked about in prepping for this webinar, but also maybe coming up soon. So sorry if I spoil anything, but really comes down to also a lot of other things. I mean, having a culture and a workplace culture where you have trust, where you have psychological safety. It's not, there's so many other things that you can address and need to be addressed as you enter feedback. Because, like you both have mentioned, if you're giving and receiving feedback and it's, there's no trust, there's no psychological safety, that won't go over so well. And so it's sort of that one, like as you start pulling the string, there's so many other things that need to also be addressed and make sure that we're reinforcing. And so that kind of leads into this next question. And we'll start with you, Aaron. But how can we encourage a two-way street for feedback between managers and employees?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, we have to have an environment of psychological safety and trust. And if that's not there, this isn't going to work. So we're going to make the assumption that that is there, that there's this psychological safety and an environment of trust between the manager and the employee. So then it's just, creating those spaces for people to feel comfortable bringing things up without the fear of repercussion. again, I'll go back to what I said earlier, which is the idea of making sure you have your facts. You can Google it. It's called the ladder of inference. I really like to share that as a tool for managers, because it can be a super helpful framework for a manager of like, how am I not just jumping right to the conclusion of, I heard this thing, it must be this. So sort of like, well, how do I know that? Is this true? And getting through those pieces. As a coach, a big thing we are taught is to be curious and to be open. And so as a manager teaching those coaching skills, or as a consultant teaching those skills to managers of, being open, being curious, asking open-ended questions, not closed-ended questions, coming from that place of curiosity, and allowing space for response, and being comfortable with silence if someone doesn't have an answer right away. I've often noticed that people, when it's silent, want to fill the space. And then the person might be reacting to something different and not the thing you actually asked. The other thing is like, don't ask too many questions at once. Sometimes people, again, because they keep wanting to talk, they'll ask 3 questions in like, I'm going to ask you a question, but then it's really 3 questions. And then the person's like, well, which one do I need to answer? And then somebody had put it in the chat earlier, but it's like really resisting the urge to fix the issue for them. It's so much like, we want to care and fix the issue, but we want to collaborate on the resolution. So I always like to have the employee go first, so if we just wrapped up a project and we're going to maybe do a debrief on that project, I might say like, hey, how do you think it went? And let them tell me how they think it went before I start to add my feedback. Most of the time when I've done that, I find that the person already knows what they did well or didn't do well. And I don't have to then give them the feedback because they already know it. So it's just good for me to know what they know, but I can add if there's something, different. Then it's sort of, what did you learn? How would you do something differently next time? So again, it's allowing them time to reflect. And there's this, again, safe space. Always you can add, yeah, I agree. Here's what I heard, or here's what I saw. And then it's becoming this dialogue and this two-way street, not just what I'm doing now, which is talking at you.
Yeah, Erin, those are great tips. I was looking in the chat because you referenced that about, and I saw a couple of messages about the sandwich method, and I think we all may have our own thoughts about the sandwich method and if is it effective, is it not? I saw a comment there, that people tend to only remember the positive, and they in the sandwich method, and they forget about the constructive feedback. So when I think about the two-way street and what Erin and what I read from the chat, I really think about that relationship that you have with that employee or individual, right? Because sometimes in HR, we're giving feedback across teams. So it's that relationship. It goes back to knowing your audience. It goes back to um, knowing yourself. Because if we're looking at that two-way street of feedback, we all like to hear that positive. That's why the sandwich method is positive, constructive, positive. But we may, and even myself included, we may not be the easiest to give constructive feedback. So I love the tips that are on the screen right now about giving yourself grace, being straightforward, but we need to ensure that the relationship that we have with this person, what we're giving, is fact-based, and that we can also take feedback. I remember when I was a consultant, I worked for an organization, and they wanted to implement 360s. And the first thing I told the leadership team at that time was, can you take feedback? And they said, and they were kind of surprised. I said, because I know you can give feedback, but can you take it? And I said the same thing when we think about that two-way street. We can give feedback. Can we take it? Can we take the feedback if it's constructive the same way we want the individual we're giving it to?
And can we really take it? Because what I've experienced is like, yeah, you can take feedback, and then you give it to them and they have a meltdown.
Yeah. And they're calling you in the middle of the night as you're a consultant and trying to now you're a therapist, right? So yeah.
Absolutely. And that we'll go right into the next question, and we'll start with you, Nikisha. But learning and development is a huge thing for employees right now. Wanting to, especially this younger generation, we've been doing a few webinars and talks on that as well, but really, really want to see what the next step is for them in the organization. And so, how can feedback be used to help employees grow their careers within organizations?
Yeah. When we think about development plans, right, and I'll start with the traditional management development plan, um, the feedback or the growth plan should it should look at your strengths, but also areas for improvement. And if an employee or individual looks at that plan as a real way to grow and says, hey, here's what I do really well, continue, let's do even better, but here's where I can develop. That feedback will help you. And again, I am an example of that, right? I years ago, I had a development plan. At that time, I wanted to be a director. This had to be over 10 years ago, right? And my manager put together a plan to be a director and showcase my areas that I need to grow in. And one of the areas was people don't know me at higher levels, right? It's, where's that? I need to buy in. And not only told me about that feedback, but also helped me understand what does buy-in mean? What does that look like? Sponsored me to have a lunch with some of her senior leaders so they can get to know me on a more personal level. So because of that feedback, and because I was so open to accepting that feedback and so open to saying, yeah, you're right. Because, that person at the time, I'll say she was a she knew she was right. So I say all of this because when we think about feedback and being able to accept it, it can definitely help us grow ourselves and grow our employees.
Yeah, and I have a story where I had to share some feedback that I didn't even really agree with. And so I had an employee that worked for me, and her role was culture and engagement. And so a big piece of her job was talking to the employees and walking around and asking, how they're doing, what kind of thing, how they were feeling about the work environment. So she was always having conversations with people. And our founder was like, you know what? Every time I come in here, all she's doing is talking to people. She never does any work. And I'm like, that's her job. But I knew I wasn't going to win that argument. So I remember taking the person out. We went for a walk, and I said, I have some feedback for you. I need to share this with you because it's sort of a make or break sort of thing with the feedback coming from the founder, and it's about the founder's perception. And so I shared with her, I was like, this is about perception. It's not about your actual work, because I think you are doing the right things. But we know that she's only in the office a couple days a week. So when she's in the office, I recommend that if you see her, go to your desk and start working. I was like, if you still want to chat with people, that's fine. I was like, but do it, electronically. I said, but I just think that will change things. If she sees you at your desk more, that's what she values and thinks is working, then I think that's what needs to happen. So she did that. So anytime the founder was in the office, she would make sure that she was at her desk more than she wasn't at her desk. And honest to goodness, that's the only thing that changed. 6 months later, the founder's like, wow, she's doing such a great job. You really turned things around with her. Are you kidding me? Like, nothing else changed but that perception. And so we had to work within the context that we were in. And because of that, she actually lasted longer than I did. I left, and she stayed there and still, had a successful career. So if I didn't care enough to give her that feedback, I may have ended up having to let her go against my own wishes, because I would have been told that this person wasn't performing. And so I felt it was my duty to give her that feedback, even though I didn't necessarily agree with it, but wanted to share that, like, hey, I think if we just make this tiny tweak, things will change. And they did.
I love the stories. They're always probably the most powerful part of these webinars, just hearing what everyone's doing differently, what other people are doing that you can take some nuggets away from. And so love it. But we have time for one more before we get to the Q&A. And this one is sort of just to tie it all together. And so we'll start with you, Aaron, but with this being majority HR audience, how can HR leaders support managers in developing their feedback skills?
Yeah, train them early, train them often. Make sure, particularly when you have people who are moving from individual contributor into manager, train those folks first. Make sure that we're training them and helping them practice. I like to do it as where you're modeling the behavior, You're giving them opportunities to practice. It might be nice to have a little cohort of people and they can have a little triad. And, one person's giving the feedback, the other person is listening, and then they're giving feedback to that person on how they gave their feedback. And so you're reinforcing, you're training them, you're giving them the tools, then you're giving them the opportunity to practice in a safe space. And then, we only get better with practice. And, I think of like athletes, like there's not an athlete out there that's not practicing every day. And that's how they get better. So we are the same way. We need to get better, and we get better by practicing. And we're only as good as the examples we've had. So giving them a nice framework. It's not the sandwich method, helping that. I like the SBI model, which you have up here. And so that's the one that I like to use and I recommend for folks, but giving them a framework, having them practice in those safe spaces for each other can really, really, really help. And then as HR folks, we can be a sounding board for people. Like I've done that where, back and forth, like even with someone who has to give upward feedback, like, hey, I have to talk to my manager about this thing and I don't know how to do that. I'm like, great, let's talk through it. And I normally start with like, well, how are you thinking about saying it? And then, I kind of help them craft their message from there. Train early, train often.
I love that you're in, especially about training, right? Training is something that takes time, especially when we're all busy and we're doing multiple different things. To take time and do a development on the job is essential. And the FBI feedback model is also great. One thing I just want to add about ensuring that we're preparing our managers is a top-down approach, right? I mentioned before I was a consultant a few years ago, and I would see different work environments, different industries, and it would be at a certain point from this level down, we want to make sure that they know all the skills and that they're aware. And then I would say, great, what about from this level up, right? What are we doing for them too? Because when you think about feedback, you think about having a feedback-centric culture that is really committed to results and advancement. It has to start from the top. So for me, it's making sure that we're living in leadership the same components we want our managers to live.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I have run into issues where it's like we're training everybody else, but the top leaders don't think they need training, or they don't want to, or they are trained, but they're like doing 30 other things in the meeting and they're not paying attention. And then I get feedback from the manager saying, well, this is great. I'm doing this. My employees feel good. But what about me? Like, I don't feel good because my manager going to do the same thing? And it's like, we want them to, but
Yeah.
so I feel like control what you can control, right? Which is, if it's how do I manage my folks? But I agree with you. Like, but sometimes trying to get the upper leaders, they're like, oh, I've been doing this for a while. I don't need this training.
100%. Even myself, I go to training at least once a month. I'm logging into a different webinar, or I go out and get a cert or go take a class, because I'm not, we're not immune to it either. We have to make sure that we're investing in our education, our development, and that we are the example of show.
I agree.
Absolutely. And I think I'm obviously a little biased because I run our webinar program here at Bonusly, but I think webinars are such a fantastic way to expand your knowledge. I mean, just the fact that they're free, there's honestly a webinar every week on something that you may be interested in. And so even personally finding webinars so easy to play in the background while you're still working. It's like a fun podcast, but I totally agree with you. And I really appreciate all that you all had to offer. So many great insights and nuggets. But I will pass it back to Tori. I know we have some questions in the Q&A, but I did drop the LinkedIns at the beginning of this webinar. So if you scroll to the top, you can find them. But like I said, I know Nikisha and Aaron would love to continue the conversation. If you have any follow-up questions, want any more stories, even just to send them some well wishes and thanks for all that they brought today. It's been amazing. It always flies by. But thank you so much, Human Resources, today for having us again, and I will pass it to Tori for the Q&A.
Thank you, David, and thank you all for such an engaging discussion today. Before we dive into the Q&A session, I want to remind everyone that now is the time to get straight from the source insight from our three panelists. Great questions contribute to a great webinar, so don't forget to submit your questions. Additionally, we understand if you need to run, just know that today's session is being recorded and will be emailed to you within the next 48 hours. And if we don't get to your question today, please connect with our speakers via the social media channels on the screen as well as in the chat. Okay, so with the remaining time, let's dive into some questions. This first one comes from Gail. You mentioned having a two-way street for feedback. How do you address the fear of retaliation or negative consequences that may prevent employees from sharing honest feedback? Erin, let's start with you on this one.
All right. Yeah, I mean, it's a real thing, right? People are afraid of that. I mean, all I can do from an HR perspective is I try to protect my sources as best as possible. If there's, feedback that can be given, and try to help that other person feel comfortable saying, hey, I appreciate that. Like, I appreciate you coming forward. I can't correct things I'm not aware of. So I appreciate that. And to reiterate that the company's policy is a zero tolerance for retaliation, which sometimes still does not make someone feel comfortable. So I have to, meet them where they are. But I feel like I've done a pretty good job in my career about keeping, being able to share, particularly as a consultant, it's much easier to do it, I think, but being able to share that feedback in a more anonymous kind of way. And, sometimes I've worked with leaders where they don't want to hear the feedback and they're like, well, who said it? And I was like, and I've literally said to people, like, I'm not going to tell you who said it because it doesn't matter who said it. Like, it is an issue and we need to address it. So, making sure that, I do my best to live in integrity and not divulge that. So again, from like the HR perspective, that's the perspective that I take. I have found mostly that, and I've worked in-house as well. So, I think in-house is just building up that credibility and people knowing over time that like, oh, okay, I can come to Erin. Typically what will happen is you have that experience with a couple people and then they tell other people like, no, actually you can go to her and like, she's not gonna, like, she'll actually help you and resolve the issue. So I've had that experience as well, where internally, like you just have those one or two people that have been able to kind of help let other people know that, hey, and that's, and how do I know that? Because the person will come to me and say, oh, I talked to this person and they told me you were helpful. And being able to kind of, but it is a real thing. And I get that fear that people have. And, again, I come from a place of controlling what I can control, which is my own integrity and wanting to help and being truthful in that I will not divulge, the source of the feedback.
I guess for me, it's going to be two things. I think when you think about feedback, it's your environment. Is your environment really a feedback-centric environment? If employees are questioning retaliation and they're questioning their job, then your organization is not really ready for feedback, and it needs to start to build the basics on how we as a company value feedback, that top-down approach. You may not be at the stage where you're going to have that free-flowing feedback. You may be at the stage, like Erin mentioned, that you might want to give feedback to a trusted member of the leadership team, typically your HR leader, or you may be at the stage where you want to do an anonymous survey to learn more about how employees really feel about the work environment or about some things that we can change. It's knowing your culture of your organization, where you are and where you want to be, and making sure that your senior leadership team is also on the same page. Because we as HR leaders, we are not going to be able to move to a feedback-centric environment without the buy-in and the guidance of our senior leaders who are willing to walk the walk as well.
Thank you. This next question comes from an anonymous attendee, and I'm sure there are a plethora of other people in our audience that have this question. How do you train leadership to give effective feedback? I have a few C-level leaders that are very poor at giving feedback, and they are very resistant to joining manager training sessions. I'm going to pass this one back to you, Nikisha.
Okay. Well, the first thing is you need to talk to your CEO and really say basically what you just said, right? We need to train from the top down, and there's a lot of resistance. And how can we expect our managers to take this training seriously if we can't get our senior leadership team to take it seriously? I know that may sound easier than it might be, depending on your organization. I know for myself, it's not hard to say, but that took years of working in HR and years of confidence and years of just being my normal blunt self. But it's the truth, if your senior leadership doesn't take training seriously, if they're not willing to invest in it, then you don't have the buy-in. And again, it goes back to the same kind of analogy I told my thank you for that. So I told my daughter a couple of days ago, and she was like, I was doing something I shouldn't do. I was like eating cereal with my hand. I know it sounds gross, but I'm going to be honest with you all. I know this is recorded, so don't tell other people. But so she started doing it, and I was like, "What are you doing?" She's like, "Well, you do it." Right? So the same analogy. If you're taking it seriously, then manager's taking it seriously. If I'm eating cereal out the box of my hand, so are my kids. So it starts there.
Yeah, and I think it can be really hard because first, like, what if it is the like C-suite that is the ones it's been my experience that sometimes that they are the ones that need it and they're resistant. And I think all we can do is lead by example and keep sharing. I've often used someone else who might be a trusted source. So like if someone is working with a coach, it's like, oh, maybe we have the coach sort of start to share that information. I've worked with a company where there were sort of a couple consultants that were working with them, and I'm like, who is the best person to deliver this message so that the leader will hear it? And it might not be me, it might be somebody else. And so I'll be like, hey, I need you to tell this person this because they'll hear it from you. So I have to, put my own, ego aside and say, you know what, like, it doesn't matter if it's coming from me. The person just needs to hear it. Who's the best person to deliver this message to them? And sometimes it's a board member or someone trusted, like if they have a coach, then it could be that person that has to sort of start that conversation.
Thank you. It looks like we have time for one more question. This final question comes from Lindsay. We're trying to nudge our production managers into giving continuous feedback. I think they do it sporadically, but we want to help them build a routine to give both positive and constructive feedback regularly, maybe as a group and also individually. What would be the best way to get their buy-in and make it feel like we're not adding to their workload? Erin, what are your thoughts on this one?
Sure. Anytime I want to get buy-in, a couple things. I like to talk to the people and just see. So whether it's a focus group or there's a couple trusted people in the group who we know might be a little more like on the change continuum, a little quicker to get through to the other side of like, yay, things are changing, and get their thoughts and opinions on how that group in particular might best get on board with the situation. So it's typically how I like to start with any sort of change is sort of little tiny baby steps towards the change by like pulling in some people. So then I can also say like, hey, like this didn't just come from HR, right? This came from your peers, and this is something that they're excited about. Another thing, sometimes I don't know how big of a group it is, but sometimes you can pilot something, right? So you get a little group that does something, and then they can build sort of excitement because they've already been through it and can tell other people like, oh, this is really great, it was valuable, here's how it helped me. And then it will help other people get on board. And then certainly holding people accountable to things can really make a difference, right? If they know that someone's watching them and that it's going to be reinforced or it's going to show up in their review or they're going to get feedback on the feedback, then they might be more inclined to do it as well.
100%. And when I think about building training programs, right, I've always worked and leaner HR teams. So when we're building a program from scratch, taking HR resources. So I always think about a training session in these two terms: either what's in it for me, or how is it going to push the business forward. So what does that mean? What's in it for me is me as an employee. How will this benefit me? Whether that's going to be in my immediate or future career plans. What's the benefit for me? Or how it's going to move the business forward? How is this going to improve efficiency? How is this going to improve organizational excellence? What metric is tied to the training, right? So it's thinking about more of the financial and personal side of development, right? So when you're thinking about training, you're thinking about how to get that buy-in or how to be able to training, look at those two lenses. Erin gave some wonderful suggestions of how this will either push the business forward or what's in for the employee. And more so than not, you're gonna have different answers that are really in both buckets. And that is going to be your basis for showing the importance of the training.
Thank you. And it looks like that's all the time we have for today. I hope you all learned half as much as I did. If we didn't get to your question today, we would like to encourage you to connect with our panelists via the social channels on the screen and in the chat. Just a few reminders before you go. The Sherman HRCI activity IDs will be sent out within the next 48 hours to those that stayed for at least 50 minutes of this live webinar. Activity IDs cannot be provided to those who view the recording. Lastly, we'd like to encourage you to participate in the survey that will pop up in your browser after the webinar. This feedback helps us to continue to produce webinars you all enjoy. Thank you to our sponsor, Bonusly, and a big special thank you to our 3 phenomenal speakers for providing us with such a valuable discussion today. And a huge thank you to you all for attending. I'm Tori, and I hope you have a productive rest of your day.
Thanks, Tori. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.